Although this is edited for YouTube, viewer discretion is advised.
This is the definitive Disturbing Games Iceberg. Each video in this series will bring us 2 layers lower on the chart, and as we get closer to the bottom, the games we cover will get darker, obscure, esoteric, and eventually we're going to hit a point where we're gonna be covering games that might genuinely be considered dangerous. We hope to weigh in other factors such as obscurity, historical importance, and as a personal bias, how uncomfortable it personally made me. This is the 3rd entry in this series, and if you happen to not have seen the other 2, do not worry. Each of these videos is designed to be a self-contained vibe, able to be enjoyed without prior knowledge of previous entries or layers. Today, we'll be covering the obscure and depraved layers of the iceberg. We're also going to go over a few notable entries that came out, got popular, or we were made aware of in the last year, so that way we can keep this comprehensive. But before we do that, we would like to thank our sponsor Aura for helping pay for the production of this project and being very patient. With that said, between the VPN, antivirus, and credit monitoring, the tool that I found to be the absolute most helpful as a content creator is the automatic data removal request. After filling out some personal information, Aura checks to see if data brokers are offering it on sites like .com, who will literally offer anything anyone could ever want about you for just a couple of dollars. Luckily with Aura, you don't need to focus on any of that. They'll be right there, ready to combat it as soon as it pops up. Normally, you have to go through a lot of hoops and ladders in order to get these people to take down your information. Aura just proactively does it on a mass scale. Considering earlier this year, someone filed a DMCA against one of my videos, pretending to be my IRL father, Aura with its VPN, monitoring tools, and automatic data removal requests would have been real nice. At least now I can limit what people can find on me with a click of a button. Stop data brokers from exposing your personal information. Go to my sponsor, aura.com/creepyreading to get a 14-day free trial and to see how much of your data is being sold. Because for me, it turned out to be a lot more than expected, and now I know why it was so easy to find that information. I mean, Iceberg, let's go. We are going to quickly cover what we missed in the previous video, where we covered the real horror and psychedelic layers. Games that either don't shy away from unsettling depictions of reality or lean so hard into its surrealness that it becomes disturbing. With this, we hope to go over everything that we missed or were made aware of in the previous year.
Martha is Dead is a historical game created by Italian developer LKA, which takes place in a German-occupied Tuscany, Italy near the end of the Second World War. The plot revolves around 2 sisters, Martha, who has been deaf since early childhood, and Julia, who may be suffering from some kind of split personality disorder. The game opens with Julia discovering Martha's body one morning while taking photographs by the lake and pulling her corpse out of the water. Julia decides to put on her twin sister's necklace and become Martha, believing that Martha is treated more favorably by their abusive mother, though Julia would feel guilty for taking her sister's identity, leading to this gruesome nightmare sequence. Julia would later discover through a recording left for her by Martha that her sister was never actually deaf and had become pregnant with the baby of Julia's lover, Lapo. Martha's plan had been to write a provoking letter to their mother Irene, explaining that Julia was pregnant and that Irene could observe this by catching her bathing in the morning at the lake. Martha would then pose as Julia, confronting Irene for her abuse, knowing that she might die but wanting to atone for sleeping with Lapo. In order to confirm that Martha had really been pregnant, Julia cuts open her dead womb with a pair of scissors and pulls out a deformed, 2-headed fetus in this scene, which was censored for the PlayStation release. Reasonably certain that Irene had killed Martha, Julia attempts to force her mother to confess to the murder at gunpoint, but has another episode where she blacks out and shoots. That's when Julia chops up her mother's body before burying the pieces under a bridge, later reenacting this process through her puppets. Another memory Julia reenacts is a time when Irene had made her eat the family dog, which she boiled alive in a pot as punishment for splashing Martha with water. With the photographs from the lake now as her only option to prove Irene's guilt, Julia develops the remaining film only to discover that she had been the one who killed Martha all along. There is a plausible interpretation of the story where Julia only exists in Martha's head as a coping mechanism for the abuse she suffered at the hands of Irene. This also ties into the game's theme of its main character using a split personality to cope with trauma and guilt. It also frames Irene having Julia committed to an asylum in a different light. Irene never killed Martha because Julia had always been Martha. Instead, her parents were just concerned by her episodes and self-harm.
Eastern Mind, The Lost Souls of Tong Now is a point-and-click adventure game directed by Osamu Sato, the same Japanese artist who would later go on to design another game we covered in Layer 4, LSD Dream Emulator. Not only was this the first game Sato worked on, but it was also created by a 4-person team that included his wife. In the game, you play as Rin, who discovers that his soul is missing and embarks on a quest to the island of Tong Now in order to recover it. Tong Now is an island that devours human souls, as he's also represented by this green disembodied head of Osamu Sato, since he felt that it was more important that he appear in this game. Eastern Mind has a heavy focus on the Buddhist concept of transmigration, or reincarnation, with the player never receiving a game over for dying as they are instead revived as a different character. These characters you can reincarnate are called forms, and each form has a different name and set of objectives. When reincarnating, the form you take is based on parts that you select from a tangle roots where eyes, nose, and mouths are growing. In order to get Rin's soul back, you will need to die and reincarnate 9 times while completing that form's specific objectives in order to fulfill their respective lives. These objectives range from collecting a set of 4 ceremonial instruments scattered across the land to journeying to a place called Xing Shang just to snuff out your own life candle and die. While Eastern Mind seems to follow more of a plot based on structure than LSD Dream Emulator, it is equally as disorientating, offering little in the way of explanation for its bizarre characters and situations. Phantasmogoria is an interactive movie developed by Sierra Online in 1995 during the peak of full-motion video games being, and I quote, the future of all video games. Nice to see how that panned out. It was written by Roberta Williams, co-founder of Sierra Online and creator of the King's Quest series, who held onto her 550-page script for 8 years while waiting for the capabilities of the software to catch up with her vision. Williams sought to create a truly terrifying horror game and felt that full-motion video and live actors would help to that end. The budget for the game would explode from $800,000 to $4.5 million over the course of development, because by God, when the queen of adventure games tells you that she needs a $1.5 million studio, over 1,000 backgrounds, and a 135 voice choir to perform Neo-Gregorian chants for her groundbreaking new horror game, you just give her that? The result was a game that would shock Sierra fans, who perceived Williams at the time as a gentle Mother Goose type individual, and even led to controversy surrounding Phantasmagoria's depictions of sexual violence and gore. Many of the deaths in Phantasmagoria may seem a little silly by today's standards, such as this scene where a woman is killed by the mad magician Zoltan by being forced to eat dirt. As a product of its time, however, the cinematic sequences of the game were considered to be some of the most realistic depictions of violence and torture in gaming thus far. Phantasmagoria was also criticized for depicting sex of both the consensual and non-consensual variety, with the latter being one of the main points of contention that would lead to the game being rejected by retailers and refused classification in countries like Australia. Phantasmagoria would even be mentioned alongside other games like Doom and Night Trap in the US Senate hearing debating the regulation of violent video games. Despite all of this, Phantasmagoria remained a commercial success and was Sierra Online's best-selling game to date.
Chu Teng is a direct sequel to Eastern Mind, The Lost Souls of Tong Now, and was developed by Osamu Sato for PC in 1995. Unfortunately, the game never saw release outside of Japan, and was considered lost media until 2013, when a coordinated effort by fans finally saw success. The game was redistributed online, and a fan translation to English was created in 2020, allowing non-Japanese speakers to experience the story for the first time. In said story, we follow Rin once again as he is approached by a supernatural being named Nanshu, the protector of the titular Chu Teng. He explains that the darkness entity, Chu Teng, has broken him into pieces and that he needs Rin's help in order to retrieve his scattered facial parts. Chu Teng is a return to form, with Sato's surreal geometric CGI art style front and center as the player explores bizarre environments and solves puzzles. At the end of the day, Chu Teng manages to be as experimental and disorienting as its predecessor, which is saying a lot.
We Become What We Behold is a browser-based game that only takes about 5 minutes to play and was developed by Nick Case in just 2 months. The game criticizes sensationalist news cycles and the algorithmically driven mass media that preys on fear and outrage. In the game, the player controls a news board in the center of the screen that displays pictures the player can take for citizens to react to, with boring pictures leading to predictable results, and more sensationalized pictures influencing the public, even if those pictures are taken out of context. The player quickly learns that this process of manipulating the public through media that provokes their emotions only goes one way. Peace is boring and violence goes viral. As the player continues to post their pictures of altercations between circles and squares, the cycle feeds into itself as more people become outraged in support of a narrative. Finally, the sensationalized public reaches a tipping point, and hell breaks out as a result. This is the point of no return as the media continues to cover the violence and riots which they themselves provoke, causing even more citizens in response to take up arms. The message here is clear. Be critical of the content that we consume, and recognize when media is trying to provoke a certain emotion, especially if it's just more outrage clickbait.
Defcon is a real-time strategy game created by Introversion Software in 2006, which places the player in the role of a general in an underground bunker during a global thermonuclear crisis. Your orders are to destroy both the enemy's civilian population and eliminate the possibility of a counterattack, while suffering as few losses as possible. Though as you continue to launch nukes, more of your own missile silos and resources are revealed, meaning that all sides are sure to suffer heavy losses. In a typical game, civilian casualties are counted in the millions, or megadeaths, with points being awarded to the player who caused the most megadeaths while suffering the least. The world map is also themed after a 1980s vector graphics computer reminiscent of the big boards that represent nuclear war in films like Dr. Strangelove and War Games, using this display to ramp up the tension and paranoia with things like countdown timers and trajectory paths for the missiles. Defcon takes the idea of mutually assured destruction to its logical conclusion with the horrifying implication that, in nuclear Armageddon, everyone dies and everyone loses.
Cosmology of Kyoto is a point-and-click horror adventure game with educational elements from the mid-90s. The game is set in Kyoto during the Heian period, and has an art style that appears to be inspired by historical emakimono art, depicting its setting as a desolate place rife with disease, monsters, and death. Instead of a clear goal, Cosmology of Kyoto uses nonlinear exploration as a vehicle to introduce the player to characters and situations which are based on the myths and legends of the Konjaku Monogatari. This anthology of tales and parables emphasizes conduct and karmatic retribution, and as such, the decisions you make throughout the game can raise or lower your karma, determining which afterlife you will visit in the event of your death at the hands of a horrifying monster or demon. Many of these realms of reincarnation involve dismemberment and torture in one of the Buddhist hells, and it is even possible to reincarnate as a dog should your karma drop too low. Notably, the game contains a robust reference section, which updates as you play and gives additional context to the game's many references to Japanese folklore and Buddhist philosophy. Much of the game's horror and tension comes from the knowledge that all of your actions are being weighed against you, and when you meet an untimely death, brutal retribution and torture awaits.
House.Wad is an extremely hard game to explain as it's one part creepypasta, one part Doom mod mixed into a pseudo-ARG experience. For starters, this game is a mod for Doom 2 hosted on doomworld.com. According to the mod page, this is a tribute map for the author's friend who died and passed away. Apparently, back in the day, making your own house was common in Doom. The post ends with the text, I miss you, Tom, which hyperlinks to this picture. When you download this game, you not only get the files for running the mod, but a journal as well. This journal contains several hints on how to progress of some of the harder puzzles and what some of the visuals in the game might mean. Although reading this for your first time, it won't click that way. For those of us who are in the horror book scene, however, we'll definitely notice how every instance of the word house is highlighted in blue, which seems to be a direct reference to the House of Leaves. The House of Leaves is a book I highly recommend that also features a story that tries to mess with the reader as much as it does its own characters through the use of jarring perspective shifts and actual book format changes. My House also is clearly inspired by many of those liminal space pictures and backrooms, which all get their own references and Easter eggs. At first, this mod seems like a simple exploration of someone's house recreated in Doom. However, interacting with certain objects or going through the building in an unorthodox way will lead to other dreamlike locations, all using similar layouts to that of the house. The mod spends a lot of time messing with the player, making them walk through nonsensical, non-Euclidean spaces, the impossible rooms that appear and disappear, throwing off your sense of self and direction. Honest to God, this is one of the most disturbing games that features Shrek as a boss fight. It's funny too, because of this design approach, when you read comments on doomworld.com, you can see in real time as people learn that this wasn't a simple recreation of a childhood friend's home, but rather something much more unsettling. We highly recommend that you play this yourself, but if you want a more comprehensive video on it, Power Pack made a fantastic video called My House.Wad Inside Doom's Most Terrifying Mod.
Super Columbine RPG is a game that has a complicated history. On one hand, it's a dark comedy video game that puts you in the shoes of the Columbine shooters. On the other hand, the attention to detail and actual information contained in the game is better than some of the reporting done at the time. For better or for worse, Super Columbine RPG is yet another example of how games can sometimes be provocative art. You don't exactly have to agree with it or like the presentation, but in the wake of the over-sensationalist coverage by mainstream news sources, some of which tried to blame everything from Marilyn Manson to the video game Doom, I can't help but think that a video game that takes that charged language and mocks it, especially at the time it was made, isn't entirely out of line. However, that does not account for taste, and it's certainly a morbid message that I would not be opposed to more people hearing, especially since these issues have only compounded on itself in the following years.
Hylics is an RPG maker game created by claymation artist Mason Lindroth, who is well known for his surrealistic imagery. Mason Lindroth's clay art was digitized in order to create the assets for Hylics, showcasing his unique style of using long, tubular pieces of clay to serve as the foundation of his landscapes. These twisting, bunching, and clumping shapes often make the architecture of Hylics difficult to read, giving the player this feeling of disorientation that comes from seeing something incomprehensible and alien. In addition to these trippy visuals, Hylics has an empty sounding OST with sparse instrumentation and reverberating acoustic guitar. The soundtrack, which was inspired by bands like Melt Banana and Butthole Surfers, gives the game this grunge vibe like you just dropped acid and the whole world is going to be melty and scary for a while. If you were hoping that Hylics would make sense of anything like you're seeing on screen, you're out of luck. Despite the relative simplicity of the game's story, all of the dialogue and exposition are all written to be intentionally confusing and nonsensical, further alienating the player as if it wasn't meant to be understood at all. Hylics may not be the most disturbing game, but it certainly makes me uncomfortable looking at it for too long.
America's Army is a series of multiplayer tactical shooter games developed and published by the US Army. It was intended to provide Americans with real-time information about the fundamentals of being a soldier as a strategic recruitment and training tool. The games were first conceptualized by Colonel Casey Wojcinski, the US Army's chief economist in 1999, were financed and distributed as a free download by the US government. It was even being handed out on discs by Army recruiters. The series also expanded to government training and simulation applications, which were used to educate real US Army soldiers, and a comic book series of all things. The recent iteration of the series, America's Army Proving Grounds, even offers features like a mission editor, though it was recently shut down after a decade of online support in order for the team to pursue other avenues of communications and recruitment. In this game, you play the role of an 11B infantryman practicing combat maneuvers. This was in order to defend the fictional Republic of Strangles against the nation of Serentia, framing the multiplayer engagements as battle drill exercises. The reason why many find this game to be unsettling is the use of first-person multiplayer as a recruitment tool. You know, for a real-world arms conflict, giving off Prometheus vibes. America's Army gamifies modern warfare mechanics like respawning and bunny hopping with the purpose of convincing mostly teens to join the army. Whether you agree or disagree with the use of video games as a recruitment tool for an army, the concept is not unique for the United States. One thing all these games share, however, is that for all their systems, mechanics, and story, they sidestep the idea of what it's like taking another human's life and how it might affect you if you even come back at all.
Corpse Party is something we should have included in the last video. It's one of the first disturbing games we even covered on this channel. Originally released on April 22nd, 1996, exclusively in Japan through a magazine. Corpse Party is a disturbing game that follows a cast of several characters who are in constant danger in a haunted school that seems to be in an alternate reality. With these gruesome deaths that happen to the characters we're supposed to connect to, along with the numerous morbid endings this RPG Maker title includes, it's easy to see why people find this title bleak. However, in the United States, unless you're in real niche corners, you would be unlikely to see Corpse Party until about 2010 to 2012. However, most of us did not find this title until 2014, when they released an E3 trailer that suggested the characters are forced to partake in cannibalism. This is also when Google Trends saw that they had their biggest spike of reach. The general premise of each of the many games that have been released over the past 20 years is as follows. Each chapter usually focuses on a different character or set of characters, who have an HP and darkness meter. If your HP goes down, then you die. But if your darkness goes down, then it's likely you will be led to a wrong end. In true Lovecraftian fashion, the darkness meter is restored by investigating corpses, notes, special events, etc. The 2012 anime, while not particularly great, shows how dark this concept can get, and how often it ends in a particularly grim end. While Corpse Party is far from modern societal fears, it's still unsettling as hell.
The Crooked Man is an RPG Maker horror game developed by Yuri Games and based on an English nursery rhyme of the same name. The protagonist, David Hoover, has recently moved into a new apartment where he is constantly being awoken by strange sounds in the night that lead him to discover belongings left by the apartment's previous tenant. This linear opening sequence sets the horror tone by leaning into jump scares that will either keep you on your toes throughout the game, or maybe come off as a bit silly depending on your disposition. It's also in this introduction where we learn about David's mom's condition. David is going through a rough patch in his life. His dreams of becoming a pilot were dashed when he discovered that he was colorblind, he went through a messy breakup with his girlfriend Shirley, but worst of all, his mother was diagnosed with a brain tumor that is affecting her memory. In this scene where David goes to visit his mom in the hospital, unnerving buzzing and ringing sounds emit from a radio in the room, punctuating the cold realization of just how far her memories have deteriorated. David's mom snaps at her son, whom she does not even recognize, calling for him to be removed from the room, much to David's frustration and dismay. We would later come to find out that David has unresolved feelings about his mom not recognizing him due to a previous incident before her diagnosis and hospitalization, where he lost his patience and attempted to strangle his mother out of frustration, only to be stopped by his friend Paul. There is a chilling, if not somewhat melodramatic plot here about the horror of memory loss and not being recognized by someone you love. After the introduction, the game has 3 levels which are more open and explorable, where David will need to solve puzzles while searching for clues about the previous tenant of his apartment, who may have more answers about all the strange things that have been happening. Meanwhile, David is being hunted by the Crooked Man, an entity that torments him with memories of his troubled past and represents the shared suffering between David and the mysterious tenant to whom he feels an inexplicable connection. The Crooked Man is also a boss that you will fight on several occasions in battles that are often cited as one of the main points of criticism against the game, requiring a level of precision that can be frustrating in the RPG Maker engine. Pressing through these encounters is worth it, however, and yields some impressive moments of psychological horror, like this scene, which stuck out in my memory even years after playing this game for the first time. There are a number of bad endings in the game, which you can get by making the wrong choices in dialogue with the supporting cast, including a sequence towards the end of the game where you play as Paul in order to stop a possessed David from ending his own life. If you make it to the true ending, however, David finds the abandoned home of the previous tenant he had been searching for, Duke McGann, and discovers that he had more in common with the entity that had been hunting him than he realized. Duke had been a young man who faced many of the same struggles that David did, but was overcome by despair and hung himself, explaining how the crooked man's neck became crooked. David even goes as far as to thank Duke for everything that he put him through, which helped him to find the strength to move on with his life in spite of its hardships.
The Void is a first-person adventure game with elements of resource management created by the developers of Pathologic. It takes place in a bizarre purgatory-like realm, referred to as the Void. The player is a lost soul which happened upon the place by accident, and now finds themselves in the middle of an ongoing struggle with the scarcity of a resource called color. This is where the game's management elements become more prevalent, as color is not only used to combat enemies and cultivate other sources of color, but also to keep your various organs, or hearts, pumping, meaning you literally cannot live without the stuff. The chambers of the Void are occupied by two factions that are at odds with each other, the sisters, who seek color to fill hearts and ascend from the Void, and the brothers, who zealously seek to control all color. And this does create a delicate balance, because helping the sisters to supply them with the color you cultivate will make the brothers more hostile, while if the brothers get their way, the Void will lose all color, resulting in famine and death. The brothers especially have some very unsettling designs, and may also be intended to draw some allegories to authoritarian powers in the real world, as the developers are from Moscow. The way that the game portrays bleakness and desolation is effective and distressing, and its unique creative vision has even led to award-winning success.
Ib is a short but atmospheric horror game created in RPG Maker 2000 by developer Corey as their debut title. In the game, you play as a young girl named Ib who is taken to an art museum by her parents, only to become separated after a power outage causes the museum to abruptly empty and lock down with Ib inside. There, she stumbles upon a painted world where the museum's artwork comes to life and finds a rose that seems to be inexplicably linked to her well-being, wilting away as she is attacked by the living art until you receive a game over. Ib is not alone in this painted world, as she encounters an eccentric girl around her age named Mary and a young man named Gary who becomes a protective and nurturing companion to Ib. Working together to solve puzzles and find a way back to the real world, the choices Ib makes and the relationship she develops with her new companions determine who lies and dies, and who retains their memory in the real world after all of this. Interestingly, when we take control of Gary later in the game, it is revealed that his perception of the art is completely different from Mary and Ib's. Instead, seeing the paintings and sculptures as grotesque and nightmarish creatures. This culminates in an intense scene where Gary needs to tear open a series of dolls in order to find a key and escape the room while a monster slowly climbs out of a painting nearby, a church bell punctuating each time it gets closer.
The Mortuaries Assistant is a horror game with procedural elements developed solo by Brian Clark and based off of found footage films like Paranormal Activity. In the game, you play as Rebecca, an apprentice mortician burdened by a troubled past that leaves her susceptible to demonic possession. Rebecca must perform a checklist of duties in order to embalm 3 bodies while also attempting to determine which body the demon is inhabiting and exorcise it. This is a time-sensitive process, and as the night plays out, the demon will torment Rebecca in increasingly more aggressive ways as she attempts to carry out her duties and solve the mystery. What starts out as flickering lights and odd noises progresses into moving cadavers and even full-on manifestations of the demonic entity, in a battle against the clock to thwart its attempts to possess Rebecca. The embalming process in Mortuary Assistant is eerily authentic, with actual morticians reaching out to complement the level of realism and detail, though some liberties were naturally taken to make the process fit better into a horror game. There are a number of grisly tasks that Rebecca must perform to complete the embalming, such as sewing the cadaver's mouth shut and pumping bodily fluids, all while the demon is watching and interfering. The game also utilizes a horror director algorithm, which Clark calls the haunt system, to keep the scares and mystery fresh even on subsequent playthroughs.
Mother Russia Bleeds is a beat-em-up style game inspired by titles like Double Dragon and Streets of Rage, set in an alternate 1980s Soviet Union where the corrupt government is in the pocket of the Russian mafia. The players control a party of 4 Ruska Romani who fight their way through side-scrolling levels after being kidnapped in a government raid, where they were experimented on and left addicted to a newly created drug called Necro. The withdrawals from this drug are so extreme that the party quickly turns to siphoning fluid from convulsing dead dead bodies oozing blood laced with necro in order to get more doses. Injecting yourself during a fight can not only restore health, but allow the Romani to enter a berserk state, which enables them to easily tear through enemies. This comes at a price, however, as long-term use causes the body and mind of the user to deteriorate, suffering from hallucinations until they become violently convulsing zombies, a fate that the party is now doomed to suffer since they are compelled to keep using necro not only to escape, but because of their addiction. After escaping the lab, the Romani discover that not only was the government involved in their abduction and the necro experiments, but they are also making shady deals with skinheads, and an organized crime group called the Bratva in order to distribute the drug in the slums. As the game progresses and the hallucinations become more intense, the party finds themselves locked in a battle with not only a manifestation of their addiction to the drug, but also the leader of the government that subjected them to necro in the first place. At this point, the Romani can refuse to continue injecting themselves and fight to overcome their addiction by defeating the manifestation without the drug. If they use necro at any point during this final boss fight, however, whether to heal or enter the berserk state, then their bodies will begin to shut down after the fight, resulting in an ending where the party's sustained use of the drug finally takes its toll.
Layer 5 strictly focuses on obscure and relatively unknown titles, or games that are more known by those who are entrenched into the scene as opposed to those who are not. There's something unsettling about uncovering a hidden gem of a game, and these weird and old titles can often give a unsettling vibe. You never really know what kind of quality you're gonna get when looking at these games. However, you can expect something unique. So with that said, let's really start this video.
R.E. Kinder refers to the English translation and remake of the RPG Maker horror game Kinder, developed by Perun in 2003. The player controls a boy named Shunsuke after he returns from a visit with his grandparents to find a nightmare version of his hometown, as well as his mother's severed head. Shunsuke bands together with a group of other kids, each of which has their grade displayed when they are in the party, and can all die in certain scenes. Some of these deaths are pretty gruesome considering the engine, as well as other examples of shocking imagery. Tragically, Perun would be pronounced dead 7 years after the game's release when he leapt from his death on a 9th floor of his home building. Part of what sets this game apart from others on our list is how it tackles the emotions and circumstances that would lead someone to such a decision. One of the game's characters in particular, Aya, talks frankly about wanting to disappear and how she lacks the motivation to carry on, even going as far as to keeping a gun on her person in the event that she needs an escape.
Necronomicon is a horror-adventure visual novel based on the Cthulhu mythos, which was developed for PC-9800 in 1994. The game is a loose adaptation of works by H.P. Lovecraft, especially The Shadow over Innsmouth, and may have also been inspired by the Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG. The player controls Jonathan Swift, a reporter from London in the early 1900s who traveled to Arkham on vacation, only to dig a little too deep into the sordid mysteries surrounding the remote fishing town. Since most of the discussion around the game is in Japanese, and the game also lacks an English translation, we recommend this video for a more in-depth look into the game's story and themes. Necronomicon has an art style reminiscent of anime, with a gritty, hard-boiled twist. The game contains CGs, or fully drawn-out scenes, involving disturbing content contained in a static, H.R. Geiger-esque border that we unfortunately cannot show on YouTube. There are also elements of ero horror, including gore and sexual violence, such as in this scene where cultists unveil their plot to a nun named Lucian, who is then forced with a monster known as a Deep One as a part of a profane ritual. And then there's this scene which I'm not sure if I want to know what's happening here.
Damage, the sadistic butchering of humanity, is an arcade shooter created by Somipelli Group, which is a small team of Finnish friends who had to schedule their development around work, classes, and military to produce the shareware Amiga title in 1996. The game opens up with a series of forwards from the developers discussing not only challenges that arose during production, but also a call to wake up and start being more open-minded towards skinheads amongst other things, some of which we can't read because they're written in Finnish. This also sets a radical tone for the game, as many of the personal comments lamenting the state of mainstream culture and how fucked up mankind's society are come off as a little misanthropic in light of the game they precede. The story is about about Michael Modelsson, who is an Olympic gold medalist, Nobel Peace Prize recipient, film actor, rock star, president's son, and the husband to Miss Universe. Everything seems to be going great for Michael, yet he is frustrated and feels like something is missing from his life that nobody can give him. This leads to Michael disappearing for 4 years, after which he was pronounced dead. But the truth is, he had actually been kidnapped by scientists and subject to human experimentation. Now, without any of his memories, Michael Modelsson has been reborn as Mike Massacre. His restless feeling have evolved into a desire to commit homicide as a measure of superiority. On the day of his own funeral, Mike Massacre kills his captors and escapes with the goal of doing drugs and ending the human race in nuclear fire. It's a little unnerving, to say the least, to imagine the kind of narcissists that would find themselves relating to Mike Massacre, or that the sadistic butchering of humanity might be the unhinged fantasies of a future fitter serial killer. It's also worth mentioning the game over screen, which shows Mike dismembered and riddled with bullet wounds.
The Dark Eye is a walking simulator style game developed in 1995 by Inkscape, the same company who produced 2 other games on this Iceberg, Bad Day on the Midday and Drowned God, an item we'll be talking about later. The game is based on 3 horror short stories by Edgar Allan Poe that can be experienced in any order and from the perspective of multiple characters. These stories not only include Bernice, but the Casa of Amontillado and the Telltale Heart as playable levels, but the Mask of the Red Death and the poem Annabelle Lee have also been included as sideshow side sequences narrated by William S. Burroughs. In rare cases where this obscure title is remembered, it's usually for its stop-motion animation and clay models, such as this butler. The clay models have deep, sunken-in eyes and animate in a way that gives their performance an uncanny quality, to say the least. Gameplay mainly consists of navigating through these performances by standing in the right places and clicking on the right things in order to advance the narrative using the short stories as a script. This lends the game a very dreamlike quality. Watching the clay people act out these stories from a first-person perspective, listening to the short loops of background noise and anxiety-inducing audio stings, only advancing the plot when you stand and look in the right spot. Furthermore, each performance also includes 2 perspectives for the player to explore, both victim and killer. There are no decisions to make and certainly no deviating from the story either, meaning that whichever you control, you'll need to act out their role in the story. An example is this scene from the Casa of Amontillado, where you are forced to trap this man behind a wall of brick and mortar as he screams and cries for mercy, only to be put in the man's shoes when the perspective shifts, living out his last moments in helplessness and regret. Also, a highlight from this game is this scene from Eugenius's perspective in Bernice, where he experiences a monomaniacal breakdown fixating on his sick cousin's teeth with a disturbing outcome.
Uncanny Valley is a side-scrolling survival horror game developed by Cowardly Creations with a focus on exploration and puzzle solving. Part of how the game creates tense moments is through the consequence system, which levies story and gameplay punishments in place of traditional fail states, meaning that if you get caught, you might not necessarily die, but you'll definitely be feeling it later. This can also lead to the story unfolding in a variety of different ways, so multiple playthroughs are encouraged to see everything that the game has to offer. You play as Tom, a frequent sufferer of night terrors who is just starting out his new job as a security guard in an isolated facility. Without much help or direction from his coworker Buck, Tom explores the various floors of the facility and discovers tapes containing interviews with a robotic-sounding woman, presumably the subject of experiments that were carried out here. Someone named Jim was hurt by the subject, which appears to be why everything had to be shut down. During this time, Tom also continues to suffer from nightmares, which may be related to the post-traumatic stress after witnessing a murder and having a bad experience with the police afterwards. It turns out that the shadow people in his dreams actually just represent gangsters who are hunting Tom down to tie up loose ends, and they can even show up to kill Tom at this new job after enough time. After finding evidence that he is being surveilled by a woman named Eve, Tom makes his way to the lower levels of the facility, where he was instructed not to patrol in search of answers, though there are other ways Tom can end up here if things play out differently. This leads to a stealth horror segment which comprises the game's second half, whereas most of the time up until now have been spent gathering clues and speaking with others. What he discovers is an abandoned robotics laboratory with hostile artificial skeletons, and his coworker Buck murdered in some kind of twisted body shop. As you may have suspected, Eve is an android manufactured by the facility, and may in fact be the same subject we hear in the recordings from earlier. Now Tom has become her new obsession, and if she manages to capture him, she has no qualms with dismembering all of his limbs to prevent him from escaping, or even killing himself.
The Black Heart is a 2D fighting game that was originally developed for Mugen, but was updated to the Ikemen Go Plus engine with remastered music and improved visuals to celebrate the game's 10th anniversary. It's also worth noting that the original game was developed solo by Andres Borghi over the course of 7 years. If you've had any exposure to Mugen Fighter, you may recognize it for its insane community-created characters and meme-worthy matchups like Chuck Norris versus Ronald McDonald. In stark contrast, the Black Heart's roster has a horror-themed cast of 9 playable characters, ranging from monsters inspired by Japanese and Argentinian folklore to a race of size-changing demonic alien worm parasites from an independent film the developer made in 2001. One of the game's main selling points is heaps of pixelated blood, which is spilled in excess when a player executes a fatal move, a super move which is only possible when you have a full bar of meter and your opponent has 1/3 of their health or less. These fatal moves include such terrible fates as Dismemberment, being used as an incubator for spider hatchlings, and Noroko's Fatal, which is kind of a cinematic first-person perspective version of her counter special move in which she basically jump scares the soul out of the opponent that disturbs her while she's crying. While fighting games tend to not have the best reputation when it comes to storylines, the Black Heart actually has quite an intricate and present narrative. If you ever decide to pick up this game, it's recommended you play the character stories in this order. As you immerse yourself into the game's story, some of the strange aspects of these grim, bizarre characters will become even more disturbing. As an example, Paquito's killer mode technique involving him using his head as a projectile may seem somewhat silly, especially given the nonsensical singing he does during the move. However, as you dig deeper, you'll find out that the move is called the Marie Antoinette attack, and also in the storyline, Paquito's psychiatrist found out that he had murdered his brother. In response, the psychiatrist beheaded him, thus explaining Paquito's ability to detach his own head. This all occurred when Paquito was a human child, before he assumed his ghoulish form. This makes his already grim wind pose all the more terrifying when you realize the severed head he's holding is his own.
The Distraint series, created by Jesse Makinen, is a Silent Hill-inspired 2D horror game where he plays Bryce, a man whose job revolves around evicting displacing people who can't keep up with their bills. The job takes a toll on the protagonist, causing his mind's sanity to deteriorate well before and after the player picks up the controller. Now, I wouldn't say Distraint is a masterpiece of game design, however it does sport extremely well done environmental horror. Considering the game is $2 to $5, it's hard to go wrong with this overlooked gem that's all about mental health and financial anxiety. Jesse Makinen has also made other games in the interim. We'd also recommend giving Heal a look.
The Lisa trilogy is already a pretty disturbing series of games on its own, with heavy themes that take an unabashed look at concepts like child abuse, sexual violence, and the trauma that comes with them. The latter 2 games take place in Olathe, a Mad Max-style wasteland filled with mutants, freaks, and perverts. The premise of Lisa's post-apocalypse is a world without women, which lends an underlying tension to the violence with the knowledge that no new people are being born, and every senseless death leads the human race that much closer to being boned. That being said, in the original trilogy, Olathe and the Post-Apocalypse are very much a vehicle to tell Lisa, Marty, and Brad's story. With this segment, we wanted to highlight a few of the fan games that allow us to explore Lisa's gritty post-apocalypse through other sets of eyes, namely Lisa the Pointless and Lisa the Hopeful. Lisa the Pointless was actually intended to be the first chapter in a series of 3, and bears the subtitle Mystics of Trash and Violence. It's been nearly a decade since the first chapter was released, however, making it unlikely that we'll see more of this series, at least from the original mod author, Edvinas Controtas. The Pointless explores the friendship between its 2 main characters, Alex Churchland, a garbage collector who learned to fight from instructional Kung Fu VHS tapes, and Joel Miller, a Hispanic man who spent many years searching for a bullet that would fit his grandfather's gun. Alex and Joel's friendship is tested by the challenges of the post-apocalypse as they try to find some semblance of a better life, following rumors to what they believe will be a more civilized place called the City. The Pointless also contains themes from The Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, namely the war of all against all, as it imagines the consequences of a world without just powers or social contract. Instead, only unchecked violence and anarchy with unhinged psychopaths constantly out to get you. In comparison, the story of Lisa the Hopeful, developed by Taco Salad, centers around a much more youthful and eccentric crew, which find themselves closer to the narrative of the original trilogy. You play as Belt Boy, a cocky yet somewhat dim-witted young man who takes charge of his small crew after their boss Rodriguez is decapitated by another gang called the Lovelies. Belt Boy's crew and the Lovelies both want the same thing: to find the girl who is key to rebuilding human civilization and is presumably Buddy from the original trilogy. While Belt Boy is motivated by his goal to save the human race, as well as the neglect he felt as a child, the Lovelies, by contrast, simply don't want to die as virgins, and will kidnap, torture, and brutalize anyone they meet in order to vent their sexual and emotional frustrations. In this hard-hitting scene from the game's default route, Belt Boy is too late to rescue his friend Liam, who had been captured by the Lovelies, and chose to end his own life rather than continue to suffer their torture. It isn't often that we get to see someone receive a burial when they die in Oleaf, which gives this scene proper emotional weight. It's also worth noting that the Hopeful's Definitive Edition contains more routes through the game, which focuses on other characters where things can play out differently. But what if we told you that this is only the tip of the Lisa fan games iceberg, and that the rabbit hole is actually a yawning abyss from which no light escapes? You've got your cool mods, like Scholar of the Wilbur Sin, which expands on Alex and Joel's story, an expansion for the Joyful, subtitled Arcantos, a joke mod that leads into the series' humor and absurdity called Lisa the Ollyful, but it only gets more melted from here. Not only is there a frankly absurd number of complete experiences you can play right now, but seemingly hundreds more of these fan games in development, as well as music, sprites, and more still being produced to this day by dedicated fans who want more Lisa a decade after the release of The Painful. Just scroll down the list of fan games on the Lisa RPG fandom site and have your eyes glaze over at the clueless, the lustful, the hintful, the braful. This isn't to discount these games, as it's hard to even imagine the kind of person who would have the time to play them all, though their sheer quantity and derivative nature makes the whole thing kind of feel like an in-joke that got out of hand. As an extreme example, take a look at this gameplay from a project called The Ultimate Mod Pack, which has earned a fair amount of criticism on the Painful RPG subreddit for how over-the-top and extra it is. Good lord, why are there so many status effects? Is that alcohol, Keith? What am I even looking at?
Grezzo 2 is a total conversion mod of Doom 2 Hell on Earth developed by Italian metal singer and game designer Nicola Piro, and is often cited as being one of the most offensive Doom mods ever created. The first Grezzo game, which never saw public release, began as a joke between Piro and his friends who were attending a religious studies class in high school during the early 2000s. The original project was developed in the school's computer room but was promptly banned by the faculty when they discovered the game and its content. This spirit of edgy high school irreverence is alive and well in Grezzo 2, where you play as a pagan farmer named after the game's developer who embarks on a killing spree with the ultimate goal of going back in time to kill Jesus Christ in the Virgin Mary's womb and prevent the spread of organized religion. This is a game that literally begins with the player a church and implies that Pope Francis is the Antichrist that was developed in the same country where the Vatican City is located. So offensive was the content in Grezzo 2 that it received attention from the Italian media outlets who called the game blasphemous for the violent and vulgar ways in which it depicts religious figures. This is not to say that organized religion is the only aspect of Italian culture under fire in Grezzo 2, as the game also has a fixation with the country's media icons and especially television hosts. While many of these references to Italian pop culture might be lost on us, it remains plain to see that the intention was merely to be as offensive as possible, considering that the game is plastered with swastikas, penises, and satanic imagery. It's also worth mentioning that by the developer's own admission, the game contains practically nothing original and was built instead by repurposing assets from other games. In other words, kinda stealing?
Bad Day on the Midday is a point-and-click adventure game written and directed by the American rock band The Residents. It was created during a period in the mid-90s where the band was experimenting with computer graphics and multimedia projects. The result of this experimentation is more of an experience than a game, based on exploration of the setting and characters rather than concrete goals. These characters are notable for their unsettling faces, with realistic eyes and mouths superimposed on the CGI models. You start the game as Timmy, a boy full of wonder and fascination with bizarre attractions at the carnival. Though there are about 10 characters in total you can control just by exploring the fairgrounds and meeting them. Each character has a unique cutscene illustrated by a different visual artist to explain their depressing backstories, and display their thoughts at the bottom of the screen to give additional context and reaction to different scenes as you control them. There are various ways that the characters can die at the midway, including the scene with the players ambushed by a serial killer who explains that death is beautiful and that he envies your freedom before strangling you to death. When the game ends, you're awarded one of several endings depending on who lives and dies, with most of these outcomes only leading to more despair. If the aforementioned serial killer is the last living adult, he will end his own life by hanging himself from one of the rides. There's also this quote-unquote good ending, where Dixie and her Nazi-sympathizing husband, Ike, leave the midway to build a new KKK-themed amusement park. How fun.
Puppet Combo is a solo game developer by the name of Benedetto Kokuzua, who creates games inspired by the slasher and grindhouse films of the 1980s and may have had a hand in creating the haunted PSX horror games boom. Initially, Kokuzua created games like Halloween 3D and Babysitter Bloodbath under the moniker Pig Farmer Games. Many of these games play out like quick slasher movies, casting the player as a horror protagonist trying not to get torture murdered by a man in a mask, and the aforementioned Babysitter Bloodbath is a good example of one such title that really makes you feel like the ill-fated and reluctant star of your own Halloween. Kokuzua wouldn't become known as Puppet Combo until 2015 alongside the development of one of my personal favorite games from them, Power Drill Massacre. If Babysitter Bloodbath is Puppet Combo's take on Halloween, Power Drill Massacre more instead adapts to Texas Chainsaw in a way that makes you feel like the final girl. In the game, we open with a car wreck that leaves the player character, Megan, searching for a phone she can use to call for help. This intro sequence where you approach the abandoned factory after spotting it in the distance does a great job at building tension, which pays off in a big way when you first encounter the driller killer who chases you while revving his drill and squealing like an animal. Power Drill Massacre would end up receiving a lot of attention from the gameplay/commentary community, which is cool because it brought a lot of attention to this very unique title. Though honestly, it's a shame that more people haven't played it for themselves. This is mainly due in part to the game's take controls, which do add tension and the payoff we mentioned earlier, but you have to suffer through slow turning and fumbling around in order to see everything the game has to offer, like this ending for instance, where you're captured by the driller killer inside of his dilapidated lair where human captives were kept, stripped down to your underwear, and locked in a cage where a serial killer torments you before eventually drilling you to your death. It's pretty hardcore and definitely worth experiencing at least once for yourself. A few other well-known Puppet Combo games released that continued this pulp horror concept were Night Ripper and Nun Massacre, the former taking inspiration from the idea of Jack the Ripper style characters who exclusively target women. In Night Ripper, you're casted as Rachel, someone who needs to scrounge up some change in order to call their roommate for a ride home while being stalked by the titular Night Ripper. While in this game you are scavenging for tools in the slums, Nun Massacre instead has you searching an abandoned Catholic boarding school while being hunted by a psychopathic nun that craves blood. This game also has more of a focus on puzzles and stealth, giving the player the illusion that they can track the nun's location and stay just out of sight before making them feel powerless again with a host of clever tricks. Also, for as long as I live, I don't think I'm ever going to forget Feed Me Billy, which released around the same time and instead leans into the twisted and campy humor present in these titles. This game puts the player in the role of a serial killer who must appease a flesh-eating entity in the floor of his closet by feeding it the corpses of his victims. It starkly contrasts Puppet Combo's other games, which typically withhold power and control from the player to make you feel more helpless, but instead allowing you to dictate when, where, and how the bloodshed happens as you interrupt the bizarre and somewhat silly activities of the victim NPCs with sudden and gruesome deaths. One of Puppet Combo's largest and most successful games to date is Murder House, which was also the first to be released on Switch as well as Xbox and PlayStation consoles. To put the game's relative size into perspective, people were genuinely surprised when there was still more to play after the prologue to Murder House, since this prologue was longer than some of Puppet Combo's full-length games. The plot revolves around a news crew, which is broken into the home of a serial killer that was thought to have been executed 3 years ago, only to be picked off one by one by the Easter Ripper. Murder House is one of those games most frequently recommended to those looking to experience Puppet Combo's body of work and wondering where to start. Also, as a quick side note, in 2020, Puppet Combo launched a video game publishing company named Torture Star Video, which was behind another game on our list, Bloodwash. Layer 6, also known as the Depraved layer, is dedicated to any entry that will make you feel bad just for seeing it. These are items and entries that often deal with taboo subject matter like kids in extreme peril, problems with not wanting to exist, among other heavy topics, which you will immediately see with the first entry here. This is also where we will quarantine all of the niche violent gooner material, so that way the bottom 2 layers can be dedicated to lost and dangerous games. Now, with that uncomfortably said, let's roll the clips.
The name of this game is literally the Japanese penal code for non-consensual sex, and in practice is pretty sleazy with its presentation. Coming from someone who has done a little more than watch a long play, this looks like it plays similar to how an NES platformer would. You take the role of a male who's chasing this woman. You have to avoid obstacles and catch up with her to steal an article of clothing. Once you steal everything you were given, one of the most unintentionally goofy looking minigames where you need to, you know. However, if you fail to satisfy her, the main character is seemingly arrested via text screen, at least based on the comments I found online, but I can't read Japanese. Bizarrely, if you are successful at the minigame, she then marries her attacker. This game is notable because it was produced for the PC-98 and at the time was the most explicit games period. According to a source I cannot verify, 177, produced by Macadamia Soft, was forced to recall and censor the product due to it being openly discussed by Japanese legislator in 1986. I'd be genuinely surprised if any copies of this game ever left Japan, so that's all I managed to dig up.
Dreaming Mary is one of the more downright uncomfortable entries on this iceberg. Much like Rekinder before it, Dreaming Mary places a child protagonist into a heavily implied abuse and SA situation. You play as Mary, a girl who likes to dream and retreat into her own mind for fun, cutesy adventures, which at first is fine. Her seeing friends and family as adorable anthro. Your goal is to collect seeds and eventually escape the mind. However, problems arise when the real-world creeps enter the dream world. The way this boar wants to give you his seed in exchange for a flower petal is a symbolic beatdown with a bat that point-blank shows what's being implied. This interpretation is further backed up because when you eventually go into the real world and must avoid the Papa character, you hear whispers saying, "He's going to find you." It's implied that Mary has an uncle that likely cares about her, but even more disturbingly, it's also potentially alluded to that they knew the abuse she was undergoing and has not taken action to protect her. The more I think about this short title, the more uncomfortable it gets. Mainly because the worst of it is implied through interpretation. Should Mary fail to wake from her dream, it's implied that her father returns and she's abused more. However, should you follow the clues, find the keys, and escape captivity, Mary is able to escape what is considered the good ending. Although regardless of what end you get, there's a lot of speculation to what actually happened. Were the other adults complacent, or were they possibly killed to keep silent about everything? All we know is that Mary escapes, and what happens after is up to us. For a first-time project, this is actually really good, if not a bit heavy. Unfortunately, from the research we've done, it looks like this was also the last project the developer released, with their last posts ending in around 2017.
Flesh, Blood, and Concrete, created by IO, is a short RPG Maker horror game that is not only free, but playable right in the browser on itch.io. So if any of these visuals look interesting to you, or if you're looking for a psychological horror about existence, or rather not wanting to exist, then we can wholeheartedly recommend this one. You play as Lyra, a depressed girl who dove off into a snowdrift with no guarantee that she'd survive. She eventually wakes up in the front of a large apartment, being greeted by a little girl who goes by Nika. The vast majority of this game is going from room to room, having brief conversations with Nika while discovering more about our protagonist and the circumstances that led to her becoming disconnected with society, disillusioned with her reality. Nika, on the other hand, is an unknown factor, as she seems to have a genuine love for the world outside too, however is trapped in the shifting walls of the apartment, which she calls her family. Not much is explained with her, but it seems that she knows and fears when you'll eventually have to part, either through death or leaving. This game ends with a binary choice, where you either choose to fight for your life, risking dying to the horrifying gore-filled rooms and starving to death before ever seeing the light of day, or letting it end in a hopefully not so painful way. I personally kinda believe that the game is trying to make a simple statement, which is that for those who struggle with these kinds of feelings, like the idea of not wanting to exist can be a dangerous fantasy, because for some, that can be a more comforting reality than continuing to fight for normalcy. The ending seems to imply that while this fight can be a tough one, even if it doesn't seem like it, it's certainly one worth continuing. Or at least that's the read I got. I highly recommend checking it out for yourself.
JFK Reloaded is a first-person simulator-style game which attempts to recreate the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. The game was created by a team of 10 people in the early thousands who took several months to research the event and war and report in order to deceive the assassin as accurately as possible. From the 6th floor window of the book depository in Dallas, Texas, the player controls Lee Harvey Oswald as the president's motorcade passes by on Dealey Plaza. After taking aim and firing, the player is awarded points based on how closely their shots match the Warren Commission's report. However, the player is also free to explore alternate scenarios and shoot whomever they may please. To this end, there is a chaos meter, which affects how heavily the motorcade drivers are affected by panic, options to further enable blood splatter and exaggerated physics, and a replay menu which allows to review the shots you took in a variety of angles and slow motion. While developers insisted that their goal was to bring history to life, it's a little eerie to assume the role of Lee Harvey Oswald in a game which simulates ballistic mechanics, crowd reactions, and the consequences of each shot in such detail. This, coupled with the fact that some of the individuals depicted in the simulation are still alive today, and the unpleasant memories which they were undoubtedly dredged up, resulted in overwhelmingly negative reception by press and politicians, with the game's designer, Kirk Ewing, claiming to have received death threats. It's also difficult to argue over the value of JFK Reloaded as an educational tool due to the unintended comedy which arises from the game's tweakable ragdoll physics. One thing that is certain, however, is that the game's dedication to accurately depicting the events mixed with this bizarre sense of humor creates an experience that is difficult not to have mixed feelings about.
Created in under 1 month, VTech Rampage, made by Ryan Lamburn, is a tactless game where once again you recreate horrific real events from the perspective of an IRL shooter. Not really much to cover here, but it did have its own original song made about the event.
You don't wanna me. Bitch.
Considering the irreverent nature of this game, a lot of people voiced concern. In response, Ryan offered to remove the game from Newgrounds for $1,000, then remove the game from his personal site for $2,000, and even apologized for $3,000, cementing that the creator clearly viewed this project as a joke. Unlike Super Columbine RPG Massacre, I don't think there's really any message to glean here, other than it's a morbid joke of a game created with the tact of a high schooler. The Slaying of Sandy Hook is also made by Ryan, the creator of VTech Rampage. However, this time it's not exactly a complete shitpost. According to Spinling's video, The Most Hated Games on the Internet, Ryan as of now hasn't been seen since about 2020. However, it should be noted that despite how his last game was received and how we feel about it, this one is a bit different. In fact, if you change the title of this one, it would likely be able to be passed off as an art house experiment or some sort of commentary on the American school system. However, in this title, you take the role of a black silhouetted, who goes on to visit a elementary school. There is no jokes, no music, just the sound of your feet, the gun, and victims. Really, the silhouettes for the students or the gunmen could be anybody, and this school could be any school. It's not exactly glorifying anything specifically or putting a spotlight at any specific person, assuming you went into this without reading the title, that is. The game ends with how most of these rampages usually go, with the perpetrator of this violence opting to leave. What's shocking about this is that while VTech Rampage of all games remains up, this one was directly removed from Newgrounds. And while I certainly understand its stance, it really feels like it was unevenly applied here when a shitpost on a tragedy is allowed to remain up, while something trying to make a genuine point with commentary is removed. Luckily, this game isn't lost media and can be found on GameJolt.
Lilly's Well is an RPG Maker horror adventure game developed by Pure Ice Blue for itch.io and Steam, where you play as Lilly, a 9-year-old girl who lives with a man named Papa, which is never a good sign in these games. Lilly awakens on a rainy evening in 2005 to a strange voice calling for help from the well outside of her window, and decides to help by using objects around the house to create a rope to descend the well with. Hold on. Is that... As long as you gather at least one section of rope, you can try to descend the well, which results in a number of endings depending on the length of the rope and materials used. Entering the well is a one-way trip, and each descent seems to result in tragic kid death, whether it be by accident, intentional sabotage of the rope, or other hazards lying in wait. Many of these dead ends also have gruesome death scenes where Lilly is mangled by her attempts to reach the bottom of the well. As Lilly dies over and over, details change and progress carries over between attempts, not only to facilitate experimentation with the game's puzzles, but also to hint at a terrible truth between Lilly and Papa. Papa isn't the man we thought he was, and every one of Lilly's deaths inside the well really happened. The well itself is something of a laboratory or cloning center, where Papa used alchemy to subject Lilly to a kid cloning experiment gone horribly wrong, a la Shao Tucker. The game also hints that this may be an attempt to create a version of his daughter that will obey him implicitly after a rift in Papa's marriage caused his original wife and daughter to try and leave him. The result is a vicious cycle of each iteration of Lilly hearing herself calling for help at the bottom of the well, and trying to help only to be killed for trying. In the game's true ending, Lilly recalls a phone number that allows her to contact the original Lilly, who was born in 1985, to whom she recounts all of the times she died due to Papa and his experiments. The two of them burn down Papa's house, putting an end to the cycle and rescuing Lilly from further deaths and suffering.
Fragile is an hour-long side-scrolling horror adventure with stealth and puzzle elements developed by Beard Night Studio. The game takes place in Mongolia and opens with a little girl walking home from school. She encounters missing child posters before suddenly finding herself being kidnapped by strange men. After coming to in a waterlogged holding cell, she discovers messages left by other children who had been taken away to the strange facility. They're now pleading for help as they're being mistreated and exploited in various ways. As they explore the facility, discover that the main purpose is to involuntarily harvest organs from the kidnapped children, though they are subjected to other forms of abuse like SA. The traumatic experiences she has inside the facility begins to form cracks in the girl's mind. represented by a fracturing effect on the sides of the screen from which the game derived its name. As a result of this, and an inability to cope with the cruelty being perpetuated by human beings, she begins to envision her captors as monsters, and by the end of the game, the complex really starts to resemble hell as well. As the game progresses, the death scenes also become more gruesome, starting out with guards who are ready to get violent and physical despite the fact the protagonist is only a kid, and eventually arriving at some pretty intense first-person POV deaths. Even after escaping, the girl suffers a traumatic breakdown because of her experiences in the facility, causing her to see her own father as one of the monsters, which can result in a game's bad ending if you choose to shoot.
My Eyes Deceive is a short, walking simulator-style horror game developed by No You High Dev for itch.io and Steam. The 45-minute experience takes place over the course of a week, where you play as an unnamed girl who lives in an underground bunker, carrying out her daily routines and making a few decisions along the way that affect how things play out. We learn that this girl has spent her entire life in the basement, where she is cared for by a man named Papa, who delivers food and medicine to stave off an illness which has presumably infected all of the outside world. We never actually see Papa since he doesn't enter the shelter out of fear of infecting the girl, though he insists that if she were ever to try to leave, it wouldn't work out well because the outside world is such a mess filled with monsters and disease. This raises some questions, however, because if Papa isn't coming into the shelter, then how are these bags of food appearing on the counter every morning? And furthermore, why is this man so adamant that this girl takes these pills that just seem to be making her feel sleepy? After some strange dreams where the girl imagines what the outside world must be like based on these descriptions, we are met with a choice when Papa seems to go missing for a few days: to quit taking the pills or to trust Papa. You can probably guess where this is going, but if girl continues to take her medicine, when Papa returns, there will be a flash forward to a few months in the future when girl is wondering how her belly became so big and round. The alternate route where girl stops taking the pills provides some answers, though they aren't pleasant ones. Without the pills to make her sleepy, girl pretends to fall asleep instead, only to hear Papa intruding into her bunker, accidentally leaving the hatch open when he's interrupted by someone at the front door. The girl leaves the bunker for the first time and discovers a pharmaceutical receipt for doses of sedative pills, the same pills that Papa had been ordering her to take, though at this time she doesn't understand what she's seeing. There were never any monsters or diseases keeping the girl confined to the basement, and the game ends with her seeing the sun for the first time. While not directly based on any singular story, the narrative of My Eyes Deceive draws some disturbing parallels to other real-life tragedies where children had been held captive by abusive parents.
Free Icecream was a school project developed by 5 students for a design class that was uploaded to Newgrounds in 2009. The game itself is a short point-and-click flash adventure that can be completed in about 5 to 10 minutes, with the premise that you, a little girl, and your friend Lilly have been lured into the home of a serial killer dressed like a butcher who was advertising free ice cream on the side of his dirty van. The player needs to solve puzzles while occasionally hiding from the serial killer, who will come running whenever you make too much noise. Eventually, you will restore power to the kitchen, which gives access to the freezer where the bodies of dead children are being kept in bags suspended by hooks. Our friend Lilly is one of the dead bodies in those bags, with the main character even identifying her corpse on inspection. While the game is definitely showing its age, and has a really strange joke about the death poops of a cat which the main character intentionally poisoned, it still harkens back to a time when Flash games had some bite.
The Fear and Hunger series, developed by Myro Havarian, started out as a series of morally awkward scenarios that Myro would pose to his classmates. Later on, this formed the basis for the original Fear and Hunger demo, which the developer used in his college thesis. Considering the content of this game, I can almost see how it came together. The original Fear and Hunger is a RPG Maker survival horror game set in a dungeon whose layout can change from run to run. You play as one of 4 characters, each with their own playstyle and reason for delving into the gore-filled dungeon. Killing enemies in this game won't increase your power, but every time you die, it feels like you get a little bit farther. You learn a new thing and more of the world opens up. Just when you think you've made it to the end, the world reveals that it goes even farther. It becomes morbid. However, the information you've gathered through each of the previous runs start to compound on itself, which really kind of lends itself to the power fantasy aspect of survival horror. Just one little mistake in this game can impact an entire run in significant ways. For example, if you accidentally step on this nail, if you don't have a green herb, then you have to remove the leg or the infection kills you. Using the bone saw and cutting the leg off will literally make your character limp for the rest of the game, slowing their movement speed. And if you're curious, yes, you can end up as a chicken nugget. This prevents you from moving and doing anything. So you'll either starve to death, quit the game, or choose to stop breathing. And sure, there is a way to fix limb loss or permanent body damage once, and it also requires child sacrifice. Yeah, I can see how this game started as a bunch of what ifs in a classroom. The game is filled with grisly ways in which your character can die, and let's just say that the content warning on the Steam page is a mile long and no joke. In 2022, Fear and Hunger 2 Termina, which changed the setting from a early medieval dungeon to the 1900s, features 8 playable characters who must participate in the Twisted Festival of Termina. In other words, a battle royale that takes place over 3 days. It should be noted that Fear and Hunger 1 and 2's gameplay loops are a little bit different, as in Fear and Hunger 2, it has more of an emphasis on the RPG skill system. Killing enemies lets you cut their heads off, which you can use to get soul stones, which lets you get extra abilities and skills. This incentivizes killing as it leads to a direct increase in power. Each time you save, time progresses in the game as well, and you only got 3 days before it all ends. So you have a limited number of saves and even fewer safe places to save. The focus on combat might feel more familiar, however, the learning curve is still very present in both titles. Much like the first game, coming into contact with the old gods is not something that's going to lead to a good end. Each of the characters in Fear and Hunger 2 have their own detailed backstory, much more than in the first game in fact, and throughout the festival they will uncover incredibly disturbing truths, especially Dan. Wait, before you click off the video, we would just like to take an opportunity to make a few announcements. The first of which is that I'm going to be a guest at MomoCon 2024, Friday, May 24th to May 27th. For those that don't know, it's hosted at the Georgia World Conference Center, and it's a fantastic time. Me and a few of my buddies are going to be hosting the How to YouTube panel, as well as the Disturbing Games and Disturbing Animations panel. The second thing is that by the end of this week or next week, we hope to have a update on the drama situation that's been going on with the channel. We are currently in the process of searching for representation. We've got a few deals out there, but we want to be sure that we're going with the right people before making a GoFundMe or asking for any money. With that awkwardness out of the way, I would like to quickly thank everyone who's made it this far into the video, as well as the patrons that made it possible to produce this. I know I'm not the fastest uploader, and honestly, a lot of my drive to make videos has been getting pretty much sapped for me. That said, whenever I go into the Discord or get a DM or a really nice comment, that always inspires me to come back and keep chipping away at it, which I am grateful for the motivation to even keep doing this after 10 whole years. This isn't me throwing in the towel. In fact, I'm hoping to increase our upload schedule as we go into the later months. We just had some extenuating circumstances these last 3 months that led to a huge delay in this project. That and the Disturbing Games Iceberg is much bigger than a normal video. Anyways, thanks for listening to this far. Hopefully I'll have some new videos out soon. I'm also planning on doing some community events, so if you happen to be a patron and into Discord, pay attention to the announcements tab, as we'll definitely have some events coming up. I've been your host at Creepy Reading, and I just want to say that you're beautiful, you're deserving of love, and I hope to see you in the next video. Peace out.
Her